Hello everyone. Mark 2:7. Who can forgive sins but God alone? It's a verse Trinitarians like to quote and then claim Jesus is God. So let's have a look at it. Let's read the entire passage here first, and then we'll break it down into a smaller chunk. And they came bringing to him a paralytic carried by 4 men. Being unable to get to him because of the crowd, they removed the roof above him. And when they had dug an opening, they let down the pallet on which the paralytic was lying. And Jesus, seeing their faith, said to the paralytic, "Son, your sins are forgiven." But some of the scribes were sitting there and reasoning in their hearts, "Why does this man speak that way? He is blaspheming. Who can forgive sins but God alone?" Immediately Jesus, aware in his spirit that they were reasoning that way within themselves, said to them, "Why are you reasoning about these things in your hearts? Which is easier, to say to the paralytic, 'Your sins are forgiven,' or to say, 'Get up and pick up your pallet and walk'? But so that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins," he said to the paralytic, "I say to you, get up, pick up your pallet, and go home." And he got up and immediately picked up the pallet and went out in the sight of everyone, so that they were all amazed and were glorifying God, saying, "We have never seen anything like this." Mark 2:3-12. And there's the key verse, Mark 2:7. Why does this man speak this way? He is blaspheming. Who can forgive sins but God alone? Mark 2:7. And the parallel account in Luke tells us that these were Pharisees. So here's the Trinitarian claim. Jesus forgave the paralytic's sins. Only God can forgive sins. Therefore, this passage demonstrates Jesus is God. And they're saying only God can forgive sins because the Pharisees make that statement. And the implications of the Trinitarian claim here are that they agree with the Pharisees. The funny thing we're going to see about this is that Jesus proves the Pharisees were wrong, and thereby Jesus proves Trinitarians are wrong. And Trinitarians are siding with the error of the Pharisees. Take a look at the parallel passage as well. Matthew 9:1-6. And the one we read is Mark 2:1-12, and also Luke 5:17-26. So let's go back and we'll just kind of break it down to this smaller portion of the passage here so that we can focus on some things. Notice what Jesus said in response. Which is easier, to say to the paralytic, "Your sins are forgiven," or to say to the paralytic, "Get up and pick up your pallet and walk"? So what do you think Jesus' point is there? His point is this: if I do the harder thing, heal a man, it will prove I have authority to do the easier thing, forgive sins. The man Jesus did the harder thing to prove he had the authority to do the easier thing, forgive sins. Notice what he says here. But so that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins, he said to the paralytic, "I say to you, get up, pick up your pallet, and go home." And that's exactly what happened. He got up picked up his pallet, and went home. Notice what it says. So that you may know. So that they will know for certain that he has this authority. Jesus will prove it to them by doing the harder thing. It's harder to heal a man than it is to say your sins are forgiven. Notice also what it says here. The Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. Jesus says that he will do this so that they might know that the Son of Man has this authority. This is a Hebraic term for a human being. For example, Ezekiel is called a son of man dozens of times in the book of Ezekiel. The Pharisees insisted only God forgives sins, but Jesus is going to prove that a man, a human being, has been given authority to forgive sins. So that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. And notice how this account ends at Matthew 9:8. When the crowd saw this, they were awestruck and glorified God who had given such authority to men. Jesus proved that God had given him, a human being, Son of Man, the authority to forgive sins by doing something more difficult than forgiving sins. By doing the more difficult thing and proving he had the authority to do the more difficult thing, it also proved by default that he had the authority to do the easier thing, forgive sins. Notice also this. When the crowd saw this, they were awestruck and glorified God who had given such authority to men. Notice who they glorified. It wasn't Jesus. They didn't glorify Jesus as God, did they? Ask yourself why they didn't conclude Jesus is God, like Trinitarians do, and glorify Jesus as God when they saw Jesus do these things. Think about that. The very point of this account is to demonstrate that the Pharisees were wrong. And Jesus proved them to be wrong by demonstrating God had given a man authority to forgive sins. And he did that by saying to them, which is easier, to say your sins are forgiven, or to say to the paralytic, get up, take up your pallet, and walk. So it's very obvious what he's telling them there. It's harder to heal a man. And if you have the authority to heal a man, by default, that's his point, that by default, he has the authority to forgive sins, because that's the easier thing to do. Notice also that it does not say God had given such authority to a man. It says God gave such authority to men, plural. That adds even more force to the Pharisee Trinitarian error. Jesus was just one man, not men. Jesus proved beyond doubt that the Pharisees were wrong. They said only God could forgive sins. But the account ends at Matthew 8, or 9:8, by saying the crowds were amazed that God had given this authority to men. I mean, it spells it out plainly, yet Trinitarians seem to ignore that. And because Jesus proved they were wrong, it proves that Trinitarians who make the same claim are wrong as well. Trinitarians have sided with the Pharisees rather than Jesus. Bad idea. Jesus regarded the Pharisees to be rotten-hearted vipers, sons of hell, and children of the devil. Matthew 9:8 only refers to the miracle Jesus did. He healed a man. The verse does not refer to his authority to forgive sins. This is a very common Trinitarian excuse here at this point. So they want to say that Matthew 9:8, well, that had nothing to do with his forgiving sins. That only had to do with his miracle. The crowds were amazed that Jesus did this miracle. But it says it's referring to the authority that God had given to men. That excuse won't work because the very point of the account is that Jesus proved he had the authority to forgive sins by proving he was given the authority to do something even greater than forgive sins. By proving he was given authority to heal, he proved that by default, he had the authority to forgive sins. Think about this if you're a Trinitarian. Would you like to consistently argue that only God can heal? Peter and Paul healed too. And healing was the greater thing that Jesus did here. So the easier thing was to forgive sins. And you're going to still argue only God can forgive sins, even though that it's easier than healing, and Peter and Paul healed too. Hence this argument is lame and doesn't even make sense, since it insists only God can do the easier thing, but men can do the harder thing. It's ridiculous. Not only so, we are told God did the miracles. Now what? Men of Israel, listen to these words. Jesus the Nazarene, a man attested to you by God with miracles and wonders and signs, which God did through him in your midst. Healing the paralytic was one of them. Healing the paralytic was one of them. So you got to think about that. It shows your claim doesn't work here. So here's how Jesus proved them wrong. The charge, who can forgive sins but God alone? In other words, they were charging him with blasphemy, saying that only God can forgive sins. But Jesus proved them wrong by doing a greater thing, that was to heal a man whole, in order to prove a human being had been given, a son of man, the authority to do the easier thing, forgive sins. By showing he had the authority to do the greater, it proved he had the authority to do the lesser, forgive sins. And the conclusion of the matter is that the crowds were amazed that God had given such authority to men. A son of man, a human being, had been given authority to forgive sins. And that's the whole point of this account. So, what we have is a situation where Trinitarians have just plucked a verse out of its context without any regard for what's going on in the passage. They use this passage at Mark 2:7 as if the Pharisees were right, when the entire point of the account is that Jesus proved that the Pharisees were wrong. And it's just one more example that shows us how Trinitarian theologians and apologists really couldn't care less what the Bible really says when it comes to, the question, who is Jesus and who is God, and those kinds of questions. Because they ignore the facts that are right in front of their nose. And the facts here were that Jesus proved them wrong. God bless you.